The wind slammed against the frail wooden walls of the abandoned stable as Mary Collier screamed into the darkness, her body racked by the agony of labor. The widow had no one, no midwife, no family, no kind neighbor to boil water or hold her trembling hand. Only the two unborn lives inside her answered her cries with kicks that stole her breath. Lightning flashed through the broken roof slats, illuminating the sweat on her brow and the dirt clinging to her torn dress. The storm outside raged like the one that had torn through her life only months earlier, when her husband Samuel was crushed beneath a fallen timber during the barn raising. Since then, Mary had been left to the mercy of gossiping neighbors and a town that turned cold when a widow had nothing to offer. Her swollen belly made her a burden. Her grief made her invisible. When her labor began hours earlier, she'd stumbled from the tiny shack the town had lent her, knowing full well they would not come. She chose the stable instead, a place that had once held life and warmth, even if now it was nothing more than rotted beams and loose hay. Each contraction sliced through her like a blade, but she bit down on her screams, afraid to waste breath. The first child came as thunder rattled the rafters. A girl, small but breathing, her cries piercing through the howling wind like a fragile beacon of life. Mary barely had strength to wipe the blood from her face before the second wave gripped her, a second child fighting to enter the world. Hours blurred into one long scream until, finally, her second baby, a boy, slipped into the world as the rain slowed to a whisper. She lay there panting, arms wrapped weakly around the twins, blood pooling beneath her, breath shallow. The cold gnawed at her sweat-soaked skin, and for the first time since Samuel's death, terror crept in, not for herself, but for them. She knew she was fading. The storm had passed, but the night threatened to take her anyway. And then, just as her eyes fluttered closed, a shadow stepped through the wide open barn doors. Boots crunched softly over the straw. A man stood there, face half hidden beneath a rain-soaked hat, his figure tall, still, and silent. His coat billowed as he approached, pausing only when he saw the twins cradled in her shaking arms. Mary tried to speak, but only a broken whisper escaped. "Please, save them." The man knelt, his hands gentle as he pulled his coat from his shoulders and wrapped it around the three of them. He didn't speak. He didn't ask. He simply lifted them into his arms, as if he had been waiting for this moment all along. The cabin was small, but its warmth hit Mary like a second breath. She barely registered how far the man had carried her, or how long the storm had raged behind them. His steps had never faltered, even as her head lolled against his chest, and the twins whimpered beneath the heavy folds of his coat. Now laid gently upon a sturdy bed layered in wool blankets, Mary blinked against the dim glow of a lantern swinging softly from a wooden beam. The man moved in near silence, his every motion careful, as if any sudden sound might shatter the fragile air between them. His face, now visible, carried no sharpness or judgment, only steady, quiet purpose. Lines carved into his cheeks spoke of years spent working the land, and his dark eyes met hers for only a breath before lowering again to tend the fire. The twins stirred beside her, their tiny cries weak but alive. Mary reached out, her fingers trembling as she checked their blankets. The man returned moments later with a steaming cloth and a tin cup of water. Without a word, he lifted her head and helped her sip, his touch steady but never lingering. The water slid down her throat like mercy itself. She tried to speak, her voice raw. Who are you?" His voice, when it finally came, was low. "Call me Ethan." That was all he offered. She swallowed again, blinking back the dizziness swirling at the edges of her vision. Why help me?" Ethan's gaze held hers for a long moment, not cold, but unreadable. "Because they didn't," he answered simply. "No bitterness, no pity, just truth." He placed the tin aside and checked the twins, adjusting their blankets, his rough hands surprisingly gentle against the newborn skin. "You need rest," he said. "They'll need milk. There's a goat in the shed." His words were few, but his actions filled every empty space in the room, tending, preparing, protecting. Mary's chest tightened beneath the weight of it all. No one had looked at her without expectation or shame since Samuel died. And yet this stranger offered no questions, no conditions, only shelter, only care. Exhaustion pulled at her again, but as her eyelids drifted closed, she whispered the only words she had left. "Thank you." Ethan paused at the foot of the bed, nodding once before settling into a chair by the door, his rifle across his knees, not pointed outward in fear, but inward in silent promise. The wind outside had softened to nothing. And for the first time since the fire stole her husband, Mary slept in peace, with her children safe and a silent cowboy keeping watch. Morning sunlight spilled through the cabin's small window, warm against Mary's skin as her eyes fluttered open. For a moment, she almost believed it had all been a fevered dream. The storm, the stable, the birth. But then she saw her twins breathing softly beside her, cheeks flushed with life, and Ethan standing near the hearth, stirring a pot of thin porridge. He glanced over, nodding, but spoke no words. The silence between them was not cold. It was solid, like the timbers holding up the roof above her. As Mary sat up slowly, her body aching, memories returned with cruel precision. How the town had whispered when Samuel died, how her in-laws had closed their doors, how neighbors avoided her gaze once her belly grew heavy. No one had offered her work or charity. They had simply waited for her to disappear. And when she hadn't, they offered something worse. Silence. Ethan ladled porridge into a tin bowl and handed it to her gently. "You'll need strength," he said. "You'll need it for them." She swallowed a spoonful, warmth spreading through her chest as tears pricked at the corner of her eyes. "How did you find me?" she asked. Ethan's gaze lowered briefly. "Saw you leaving town 2 days ago, carrying nothing, knew where you were headed." Mary clenched her jaw, shame and anger twisting together. "They let me go, Ethan. They knew I had nowhere." He didn't respond. He didn't need to. The truth had already been spoken. She looked toward the twins, their tiny chests rising and falling beneath Ethan's coat, still wrapped around them like a promise. "What will they say now?" she whispered. Ethan's voice was steady. "Does it matter?" Outside, the door creaked open as Gideon, a wiry ranch hand from town, stepped inside with an armful of chopped wood. "Figured you'd need more," he said, eyeing Mary and the babies with a soft nod. "You've got friends still, Miss Collier, even if they were late to show it." Mary's breath caught. "Why help now?" Gideon glanced at Ethan. "Because someone stood first. Makes it easier for the rest of us to follow." As the fire crackled and the cabin filled with the scent of fresh wood and warm oats, Mary felt something shift, not in the town, but in herself. She was no longer the widow they had pitied or ignored. She was a mother, and she was no longer standing alone. Ethan returned to his chair by the door, his silent watch continuing. Outside, the valley was waking. And for the first time since Samuel's death, Mary felt something stronger than grief rise within her. Hope. The days settled into a rhythm that Mary had never known before, not the desperate rhythm of survival, but the steady beat of quiet care. Ethan chopped wood before dawn, gathered goat's milk for the twins, and kept watch on the ridge like a man who understood danger even when none showed its face. He spoke little, but his presence filled every gap that loss had carved into her. The twins grew stronger beneath his silent guardianship, their cheeks plumping, their cries turning into soft coos that warmed even the coldest mornings. Mary mended what she could, sewing tiny garments from old flour sacks, while her body slowly recovered from the long labor that had nearly stolen her life. One afternoon, as the first snowflakes danced across the hills, Mary sat by the fire, the twins cradled in her arms. Ethan stood nearby, sharpening his knife, his quiet rhythm matching the flicker of the flames. "They'll need names," she said softly, more to herself than to him. Ethan's hand slowed, but he didn't speak. Mary glanced up, meeting his steady gaze. "Samuel always said if we had a boy and girl, he wanted to name them after his parents, Clara and Thomas." She paused, her throat tightening. "But it feels wrong. Like they belong to someone else's plan, someone who isn't here." Ethan set the knife down gently and approached, his boots silent against the wooden floor. For a long moment he stared at the babies, then looked into Mary's eyes with that rare stillness that always preceded his few words. "You carried them through fire," he said. "You gave them life when the town turned away. They should carry your name." Mary blinked, her breath catching. "Collier?" He shook his head. "Your name. What you gave them. Strength." His voice dropped lower, rich with something she hadn't heard in any man's voice since Samuel. Respect. "Call them Grace and Will." The simplicity of it struck her like a bell ringing clear across the valley. Grace, for what had been spared. Will, for what had endured. She nodded, her vision blurring as she whispered the names over their tiny heads. "Grace. Will." The twins squirmed in response, as if recognizing the gift. Ethan stepped back, returning to his quiet corner by the door, but something had shifted between them. Unspoken, yet heavier than words. These children no longer belonged to grief. They belonged to the future they were building in this cabin, plank by plank. And though Ethan never said it, Mary knew what he had offered her tonight was more than names. He had given them a beginning. The knock came just after dawn, sharp and deliberate. Mary froze, her hands still cradling Will as Grace whimpered softly beside her. She hadn't heard a visitor approach in weeks. Ethan was already at the door, rifle lowered but ready, his eyes narrowing as he cracked it open. On the other side stood Councilman Reed, flanked by two other men from town. Faces Mary recognized, faces that had looked away when she'd begged for work months ago. Now they stood straight, their expressions carefully measured. "Morning," Reed said, trying to sound cordial. "We heard..." Words traveled. "You've had your children, Mary, and you've taken up residence on property that doesn't rightly belong to you." Ethan said nothing, but his frame filled the doorway like a wall. Mary's voice came steady, though her chest tightened. "This was Samuel's uncle's land. He left no claim, and no one contested it when I was left to fend for myself." Reed's lips twitched, as if suppressing irritation. "You were widowed, childless then. Now you've two mouths to feed. The town feels it best if arrangements are made. For their welfare, of course." Mary's stomach turned. She recognized the words. Polite theft, wrapped in concern. "You mean take my children," she said flatly. The second man, Ellis, stepped forward. "There's a couple west of town, wealthy, proper. They can offer more than this arrangement." His eyes flicked toward Ethan, dismissive. Mary's pulse pounded, but Ethan spoke before she could. His voice was soft, but carried like a distant roll of thunder. "The town had its chance to help her. You turned her away." Reed stiffened. "We were doing what we thought proper." You thought proper was leaving her to die in a stable, Ethan answered. The silence that followed was heavy. Reed straightened, forcing a brittle smile. Be careful, mister. The law favors those who act first. Ethan's gaze never wavered. And so do I. The councilman hesitated, sensing the weight behind his words. Ellis shifted uncomfortably, and Reed finally sighed. We'll speak again. They turned and left, their boots crunching over the frost-covered earth as they vanished into the trees. Mary exhaled only when their figures disappeared. They'll be back, she whispered. Ethan closed the door gently and returned to her side, his voice calm. Then we'll still be standing. He glanced at the twins, then at her. You're not alone now. As the fire crackled and the twins breathed softly against her chest, Mary felt it again. That same steady weight Ethan always carried. Not just protection, not pity. Something far more dangerous to those who had turned her away. Quiet, unshakable loyalty. Snow arrived heavier that night, blanketing the valley in silence, while wind whistled through the cracks of the cabin like old ghosts testing for weakness. Ethan had sealed the windows tight with extra cloth, and Mary kept the twins bundled close to the stove, their tiny bodies radiating warmth back into her chest. Yet it wasn't the cold that gnawed at her. It was the knowledge that Reed and the others would return. The town had ignored her when she was a widow alone. But now that the children had survived, they saw value where once they saw burden. That made them dangerous. Gideon arrived by lantern light, stamping snow from his boots. He carried a satchel of dried meat and oats, placing it beside the hearth. More folks are talking in town, he said quietly. Not everyone agrees with Reed. Some say it's a disgrace what they tried to do. Mary glanced at Ethan, who said nothing, his eyes fixed on the fire. Gideon continued, lowering his voice. There's a meeting planned. Reed's pushing for custody to be taken by force. Claims you're unfit. Claims you were never married proper. The words sliced through her like ice. They mean to take them. Gideon nodded grimly. By spring, if not sooner? Mary swallowed hard, her throat burning. What right do they have? The right they give themselves, Ethan said finally, his voice low. Unless someone stands between. The three sat in heavy silence, the crackle of the fire the only sound. Outside, the wind howled like a warning. Then Ethan spoke again, and this time his words carried something new, a quiet finality. You have no papers, no claim they respect, but you have me. Mary's breath caught. What are you saying? He met her eyes, steady and sure. If you were my wife, they couldn't touch you. Not by law. Not without crossing me. The words hung in the room like an unlit lantern. Simple, unadorned, yet full of light waiting to be released. Mary's hands trembled as she pulled the twins closer, her heart pounding not with fear, but with something far heavier. Choice. This man who had carried her from the stable, who had guarded her children without asking, who had given them names and fire and hope. He offered no romance, no sweet promises. Only shelter, permanence, family. She stared at him, searching his face for hesitation and finding none. You would do that? For us? She whispered. Ethan nodded once. For all of you. And in that moment, Mary realized she was no longer choosing between survival and dignity. She was choosing a life that would belong to all four of them. The wedding was simple, done at dawn beneath the old cedar tree behind the cabin. There were no guests from town, no music, no fine dresses or lace veils. Only Gideon standing beside them as witness, his face serious beneath his wool cap. The snow still clung to the ground, sparkling beneath the first rays of light, as though the earth itself recognized the weight of the moment. Mary wore the same mended dress she'd delivered her twins in, the stains now long scrubbed clean, but never forgotten. She held Grace and Will in her arms, their breaths rising like soft clouds in the cold morning air. Ethan stood before her, his coat buttoned against the chill, hat in his hands, his silence as steady as ever. Gideon cleared his throat softly. "I ain't no preacher," he said, voice rough, "but I reckon this don't need a preacher. It just needs truth." He looked between them. "Ethan, do you take this woman, her children, and the life that comes with them?" Ethan's voice was low but firm. "I do." Gideon turned to Mary. "And you, Mary Collier, do you take this man, not out of fear but out of choice?" Her throat tightened, but her voice was steady. "I do." The words weren't loud, but they carried through the frozen air like a promise etched into the very trees. Gideon nodded once. "Then it's done." Ethan reached out, his rough hands cradling Mary's fingers as though they might break. But she only squeezed back harder. No ring was offered, no papers signed, but what passed between them was stronger than any law could recognize. They were not two broken souls seeking shelter anymore. They were a family. As they stood beneath the cedar, the twins stirred, small cries rising into the morning. Without hesitation, Ethan reached and gently took Will into his arms, while Mary shifted Grace against her shoulder. For the first time, the four of them stood as one. Gideon smiled faintly and stepped back, giving them the space that only belonged to a family now fully formed. The wind softened, as if even nature dared not interrupt what had just been forged. And for the first time since Samuel's death, Mary felt not like a widow starting over, but like a woman who had built something unbreakable from the ashes. A family not given, but chosen. A future not begged for, but claimed. The knock came again, harder this time, rattling the newly fitted door as winter's edge began to loosen its grip on the valley. Mary stood by the hearth, holding Grace close while Will slept in the cradle Ethan had carved by hand. Ethan was already at the door, rifle in his hand, but lowered, calm, steady, ready. When he opened it, Councilman Reed stepped forward with 2 deputies in tow, their faces tighter than before, their patience thinner. "We heard the rumors," Reed said coldly. "The marriage, the land. You think a few spoken words and a name on the lips of children changes the law, Mr. Kane?" Ethan said nothing, but his eyes held firm, as always. Reed's lips curled. "There's been no license filed, no church record, no formal witness beyond a ranch hand. This," he gestured towards Mary inside, "is nothing more than unlawful cohabitation. The children remain illegitimate." Mary's breath caught, but before she could speak, Gideon's voice rang out from behind the councilman, clear and sharp. "You're wrong, Reed." All eyes turned. Gideon stood tall, holding a folded document in his calloused hand. "The circuit judge passed through last week. I made sure he saw the ceremony, filed the papers proper, and signed the license himself. They're husband and wife now, by law and by witness." He handed the papers to Reed, who snatched them, scanning the official stamp in frustration. The deputies shifted uncomfortably, their hands falling from their belts. Reed's voice lowered, bitter. "You think this will hold? You think the town won't still judge her?" Ethan finally spoke, his voice soft but cutting. "The town already judged her, and then it walked away. We're done waiting for their mercy." Reed's face flushed with quiet rage, but he had no ground left to stand on. After a tense moment, he nodded stiffly to his deputies and turned away, the 3 of them disappearing back into the cold morning. When the door closed, Mary leaned into Ethan's side, her body trembling with relief. Gideon placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "You're not alone in this, friend. Not anymore." The fire crackled as Ethan set his rifle aside, reaching for Will while Mary held Grace close. Outside, the snow melted beneath the first warm breath of spring. Inside, the cabin stood stronger than ever, not because of laws or papers, but because this family had refused to yield. And now, for the first time, the valley was learning they never would. Spring pushed through the valley like a long-awaited hymn, warming the soil, waking the creeks, and sending new life crawling up from the thawed earth. Word of the marriage faded, but word of the children did not. Townsfolk who had once turned their backs now found reasons to pass by the cabin, peering toward the porch where Grace and Will cooed in the morning sun, bundled in quilts stitched by Mary's worn hands. It was Will who first caught their attention. A strong, bright-eyed boy whose laughter rang through the clearing like tiny church bells. Gideon often joked that Will's laughter could shame the coldest banker into smiling. And Grace, though smaller, held a quiet strength in her eyes, wide and steady, mirroring her mother's resilience. One afternoon, as Mary hung fresh linens, old Mrs. Greeley arrived unexpectedly, clutching a basket of bread and preserves. She shifted nervously on her feet as Mary approached, wiping her hands on her apron. I thought the little ones might need some sweetening," Mrs. Greeley stammered. Mary blinked, unsure whether to speak or simply accept the unexpected kindness. Ethan, sitting nearby whittling a small wooden horse for Will, nodded politely, but remained silent. Mrs. Greeley cleared her throat. "It's shameful what they tried to do," she whispered. "The councilman, I mean. The town's been talking." "They've always talked," Mary said gently. "Now they're listening." Mrs. Greeley offered a thin, almost embarrassed smile. "Well, maybe it's time some of us listened better." She glanced toward Will and Grace, her voice softer. "They're strong. You've made something good here." And just like that, the first stone shifted. Over the next weeks, others followed. An extra sack of flour left by the fence, spare cloth left hanging on the gate, a neighbor offering to repair the cabin roof before the summer rains came. The children weren't just Mary's anymore. They were becoming the valley's hope. Proof that something good could rise from shame and silence. One evening, as dusk painted the hills in soft lavender, Ethan spoke as they sat on the porch, watching the twins sleep. "You didn't just survive, Mary," he said, voice low. "You taught them to see you." She glanced at him, eyes glistening in the fading light. "No, Ethan," she whispered. "We taught them. All four of us." And as the moon lifted over the ridges, Mary knew the battle was not only won, it was being rewritten every day these children lived and laughed in the house built from ashes, guarded by a man who had once been a stranger, and now was so much more. Summer arrived like a quiet celebration. Wildflowers colored the meadows, bees hummed around the cabin porch, and the valley finally seemed to recognize the family not as scandal, but as belonging. Even the councilmen kept their distance now. Papers filed, mouths closed, and power quietly surrendered. The whispers had softened into nods, the sidelong glances into greetings. But it wasn't until that Sunday afternoon that Mary felt the final wall break. The church picnic brought nearly every family in the valley. Tables lined with pies and fresh bread stretched beneath the tall pines. Children chased one another through the tall grass, and for the first time, no one looked twice at Mary's place beside Ethan. Grace clung to her shoulder, sleepy from the heat, while Will toddled around nearby, his tiny legs strong beneath him. Sheriff Banning approached with his wife and nodded politely, offering a tin of honey as a gift for the twins. "They've grown strong," he said, his voice lighter than Mary had ever heard. "Good stock, these two." Mary smiled, feeling Ethan's hand settle gently at the small of her back. "They've had good hands guiding them," she answered softly. The sheriff paused, as if weighing something heavier, then said, "You've built something here, Mary. Something lasting." As he walked away, a small voice called from behind. "Mama?" Mary turned instinctively, her breath catching in her chest. It was Will, his first clear word, spoken without hesitation, his little hands reaching for her as he stumbled forward. The words struck deeper than any promise, any paper, any vow ever spoken beneath that cabin's roof. "Mama." Ethan scooped Will into his arms, smiling quietly, while Grace stirred against Mary's chest, her tiny fingers curling around the fabric of her dress. Around them, the townsfolk watched, but not as judges, not as skeptics. They saw a family that no storm, no councilman, no shame could break. That evening, back at the cabin, as lantern light flickered against the wooden walls they had built together, Ethan pulled Mary close. "He chose his first word well," he whispered. Mary rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heart. He chose his truth. Outside, the wind carried through the trees like a song long waiting to be sung, and in that cabin, born from ashes, raised by faith, guarded by love, a generation would rise, carrying not the weight of their mother's sorrow, but the strength of her name. Please like, share, and subscribe to support more true-hearted stories on Stories Left Behind. If you had seen her there, would you have stepped in too? Tell us in the comments.